All right, let's talk about seasonal affixes. So seasonal affixes are incredibly polarizing just to the player base in general. Some people love them, some people don't love them as much. But seasonal affixes got removed at the end of season one. That left a lot of people questioning why remove seasonal affixes. Is this actually going to be better for affixes as a whole? What is this realistically going to look like for the game? And so now I think that after we've had a few months that has passed, and now a season and a half, almost 2 seasons of not having seasonal affixes, we can kind of take a look at what seasonals did right, what they did wrong, and kind of like should they come back. So the most recent seasonal we had was maybe one of the least enjoyed ever, and that was Thundering. Thundering ended up, spawning these Razageth circles on the ground, and you had to match your marks, otherwise you were going to get stunned and effectively die. And now we've had a lot of seasonal affixes, and so let's talk about what seasonal affixes did right and what they did wrong. So first and foremost, what seasonal affixes do right is they really make, first off, I think for RP reasons, they make the season feel like pretty unique, right? Where they really change up like the dungeon, and the impact level of seasonal affixes is really high. And if you go back to this dungeon list, these are some really, really impactful affixes. Prideful completely changes how you route. Infested completely changes how you route. Awaken changes how you route. Reaping, you have boss mobs that spawn every 20%. In Beguiling would end up changing like what you're doing on a week by week basis. Even Tormented, you would fight mini bosses with bosses. Shrouded, you would end up like having to figure out how many of the buffs you wanted to get. Encrypted, you kind of had to figure out what relic you were going to get. Thundering, you kind of had to figure out when you wanted to clear versus when you weren't. And the level of impact of these affixes, I would say, is orders of magnitude higher than just other casual affixes, right? And if you look at the other affixes, compare it to something like a Sanguine, compare it to something like a Volcanic or an Entangling or a Storming. Seasonal affixes have and always will be fundamentally more impactful than that. And that's something that I think that they do well, is that they make the impact level is super high. And so because the impact level is super high, they're allowed to actually kind of do unique things. And the flavor of the season is also something that kind of gets factored in, right? Where it's kind of interesting whenever you like have something like Awakened that works with N'Zoth, right? And it's a very N'Zoth centric theme. And you have something like Infested, and that works with Gahoon, and it's a very Gahoon like themed affix, I guess is how I would describe it. And I think that that's actually kind of a cool thing. On top of that, some of the seasonal affixes are some of the best affixes ever. You think back to some of your favorite affixes, Shrouded, Awakened, Reaping come to mind. Encrypted also, very, very good affixes just as a whole. And so I think that those are some of the things that, seasonal affixes do well, is the fact that because they're allowed to be so impactful and so important, they're allowed to really, really shine in those regards whenever they're designed well, whenever, players are enjoying playing them. Now let's talk about the downsides of seasonal affixes. The downside of seasonal affixes is that most of them are either mid or not very good, and they're apparent for the entire season, right? If you think about it, Prideful had some very negative drawbacks once you got to pushing like higher end keys. For people who just did more casual keys, Prideful probably not even that bad, and honestly, maybe even a good affix. But it was too polarizing. Infested, Infested is probably one of the worst affixes they've ever designed, where just the way that it interacted with mobs is really bad. Beguiling also has that same issue. Thundering was terrible. And Thundering is the most recent seasonal affix, and Thundering was terrible. Honestly, it just showed up far too often and was just kind of too important relative to your key. And if you ever messed it up, then you would wipe. And that's kind of, while it is a good thing, right? It's a good thing for seasonal affixes to be important. It's going to be something that you see the entire season. It also can create a negative if the seasonal affix just isn't that good. Say the seasonal affix is just average to bad. Then you're in a situation where it's just not fun for an entire season, and that creates like a weird paradigm where Blizzard's going to have a problem if the seasonal affix just isn't fun, because it's going to be there for the entire season. And so that's what I would say is like a pretty large negative, is just like most of the seasonal affixes have been either bad to mid, even some of the ones that aren't even that terrible, like Tormented, just weren't very good. Like they were fine, but they weren't great, right? Like they were just kind of there, and I don't think that that's like what people want out of seasonal affixes. Uh, and so now that kind of shifts the question as to should seasonal affixes return. And to that answer, I'm not even sure. Most of the seasonal affixes have been bad, and if we're really if 75 to 50, if 50 to 75% of the seasonal affixes are bad, and only like 4 of them over the history of the time that we've had seasonal affixes have been good, like that creates a situation where that really calls into question as to whether or not seasonal affixes should return. And like, and I'm not really sure the answer. If Blizzard, and this is my kind of my personal opinion, if Blizzard can guarantee us good seasonal affixes, I think that seasonal affixes absolutely should return because their impact level is so high, and because they can be so interesting. I think that those are some of the best designed affixes because they can be so intricate. I think that personally, for me, Shrouded is one of my favorite affixes of all time. I know a lot of people love Encrypted. I really, really, really liked Shrouded. I thought that there was some issues with the mini bosses tuning, but fundamentally, how Shrouded changed the dungeons, and we still were asking the question even late into that patch. Like, are we supposed to pull more Shrouded mobs for like stat buffs? And it made you feel very powerful, and I think that's cool. Like, you could argue that it maybe made you feel too powerful, which is a valid argument. But at the same point, it felt nice, and I think that that's what I want to see out of the seasonal affixes. But if Blizzard can't guarantee that, then I think that I'm okay with seasonal affixes staying retired. Now, I will say that we don't need seasonal affixes if Blizzard is rotating dungeons every single season. If the dungeons are seasonal, we don't need seasonal affixes. And why that is because seasonal affixes came into the fray and were designed as a way to kind of like spice up every single season. It gives a bit flavor towards the raid, gives it a bit flavor towards the season itself. But fundamentally, it was an issue of you're running the same 8 dungeons for an entire 2.5 year period, and that's not realistically doable unless you have something that's a bit more important, like seasonal affixes, or something that spices up your gameplay, like seasonal affixes. And so that's why they were designed and introduced after Legion at the very beginning of BFA. But whenever we have dungeons that change every single season, that creates a situation where you don't necessarily need to have seasonal affixes, right? You don't necessarily need the dynamic of like the whole entire season to change from season to season, because we're getting that on a per season basis with the dungeons. And I think the dungeons do a good job by themselves of actually spicing things up more. You have that learning process through every single season. And I released a video the other day talking about how seasonal dungeons have done. And I think that seasonal dungeons have been, in my opinion, a massive success. I don't really want to go back to the, we only have 8 to 10 dungeons for an entire expansion. I don't want to go back to that. I think that what they've done with the seasonal dungeons has been phenomenal. It keeps me far more engaged now than I was in the past with Mythic Plus, because it kind of changes how every single season feels to play. And say you don't like the dungeon pool, or the dungeon pool doesn't feel great, you're not forced to play it, right? You're not forced to play like an entire expansion that you don't want to. I didn't like the Shadowlands dungeon pool, and so then I got left out in the dust and kind of left out where I didn't know what to do. Like, am I supposed to play even though I don't like the dungeon pool? That doesn't feel right. And so I think that rotating dungeons really solves a lot of the issues that seasonal affixes could not. Seasonal affixes, while they were very impactful, they weren't as impactful as completely recycling out the dungeons. Yeah. And so if I have to kind of pick one between seasonal affixes and dungeons, I'm picking the dungeons every single time. Now, I think there's a situation where Blizzard can completely rework the affix system. And I think that this is maybe what I would recommend. Completely rework the affix system, remove the on-death affix rows, and then bring back seasonals every single season. And so then we only have, Fortified Tyrannical is one row, and then one row of, generic weekly affixes, and then a seasonal on top of that. And I feel like, to me, that would be a pretty good compromise with the rotating dungeons as well. On top of that, we've seen a lot of issues with just affixes in general across this entire expansion. And so that's something that Blizzard struggles to make perfect. And it's a situation that I'm not sure if Blizzard will ever make perfect, right? I don't know So the affixes are actually relatively balanced relative to one another, and you see this pretty consistently with like the TGP, right? Where the hardcore formats where players are required to push on keys or dungeons or affixes that are suboptimal, you're able to do within half a key level of the max. But the problem with affixes a lot of the times is that they just don't feel good to play, and so that creates a kind of um, a weird issue where it's like, if this doesn't feel fun, like is this really the right way of approaching it? And now there should always kind of be some level of players kind of being disgruntled with the game, right? There should be a level of friction. I guess that's the best way of describing it. There should be a level of friction where players don't feel like they're spoon-fed everything. But this is a situation where there are some affixes, and I can think of like raging is one of them for me, where I feel like I'm playing the affix correctly, and then if I don't hit the best oppressing roar of my entire life, and even if I do sometimes, it just doesn't, like, will wipe to something, right? And it's like, oh, I should have seen this in hindsight, I guess. I should have known 20 seconds in advance that this was going to happen. Bolstering is kind of the same way, where realistically you see some high level keys being timed on bolstering, but it's just like not that great. And so I think that like a complete affix rework would be pretty good, and just kind of looping this back into seasonals, a complete affix rework would be pretty good. And then if you slot in seasonals on top of that, plus the rotating dungeon pool, I think we could achieve something pretty good. But again, this is assuming that Blizzard is able to guarantee that seasonal affixes are going to be the good seasonal affixes as opposed to the mid to bad seasonal affixes. Even mid seasonal affixes are probably fine, but some of the worst affixes I've ever played end up being seasonals. I think that Beguiling is one of my least favorite affixes of all time. Like that seasonal was terrible, and it ended up making that season a lot worse because of it. Anyways, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts down in the comment section below. I hope to see you guys in the next video, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.